don't know how else to start this one, honestly. Well, everyone, it's the holiday season, and I'm just about ready to spend some quality time with the family, you know, celebrating with all that Christmas cheer and stuff. But unfortunately, the time has come for me to talk about SRB2. Again. You see, something's been bugging me for a while now. It's something that bothers me every time I watch new players try out SRB2 for the first time, although it's probably not what you're expecting. SRB2's unorthodox controls? Nope. SRB2's janky camera? Not a chance. The Thok? No. Rather, what I'll talk about today is something about SRB2 that I don't think many people really notice or really care to talk about. Today's subject comes in 3 colors, flings you high into the air, and goes boing. It's time to talk about springs, and why SRB2 springs are worse than you might think. So when it comes to springs in Sonic games, I don't really think they need much of an introduction. But for the sake of this video, I think I'll do a quick rundown. Springs are pretty simple. You jump or run into one and you're launched in whatever direction the spring is facing. Most of the time they're helpful and allow you to progress further into a level or access hidden areas. However, sometimes springs are used as obstacles and can launch you into hazards, send you flying in the wrong direction, or both of those things at once. Springs normally come in 2 colors, red and yellow, with the difference between them being that red springs send you higher than yellow springs. In SRB2, however, there's a 3rd color, blue. Blue springs are also the weakest type of spring and don't launch you very high or very far. They're also not too common and only see use in a handful of areas in the vanilla SRB2 levels. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, you might be thinking, Sandwichface, what's wrong with SRB2 springs? They're the same as normal classic Sonic springs, right? Well, not exactly. You see, the obvious difference between the classic Sonic games and SRB2 is that the latter has what we in the business call the 3rd dimension, and some new spring-related issues arise as a result of that. The first one of these issues I'd like to talk about has to do with spring placement and directional influence. In the classic games, springs were usually placed up against walls, and the ones that weren't didn't leave any ambiguity on where you had to go. It's left or right, and 9 times out of 10 in a classic Sonic game, you're going right, so just holding right is usually a safe bet. However, in SRB2, the extra dimension throws a wrench into that notion. You can't just hold a direction without consequence. In fact, it's actually not a good idea to hold a direction on a spring unless you know exactly what you're doing. Sometimes, springs are placed in locations where it's not entirely clear which direction it's supposed to be headed in. Or worse, you'll not only smack into a wall, but also fall into a hazard or even a bottomless pit. The worst example of directional influence on springs would have to be with diagonal springs. Many levels use diagonal springs in such a way to where they're chained together like in the official 3D Sonic games, and like those games, they're usually utilized for the sake of automation. However, SRB2's diagonal springs don't lock your controls like in the official games, which means using them for automation like this doesn't always work as intended. Every person I've introduced SRB2 to always has trouble with the diagonal springs in Greenflower Zone Act 2 because they don't understand that you need to stop pressing forward when you hit them. They always overshoot the second spring in these spring chains because of this, and they usually won't figure out what they're doing wrong until I tell them, hey, stop pressing buttons. The second issue I'd like to discuss has to do with spring collision. In the classic Sonic games, springs were completely solid from all sides, and you would only be launched if you hit the spring in whatever direction it was facing. You wouldn't bounce off an upward spring if you ran into it from the sides, for example. In SRB2, however, springs launch you in their specified direction the second you touch them. It doesn't matter where or how, as long as a single pixel of Sonic is touching a spring, he's getting launched to Mars. This creates a lot of the directional influence issues with springs, as most players are just going to run into a spring and continue to hold forward without thinking twice, rather than stopping to use a spring so that it functions properly and sends the player to the right place. Additionally, springs in SRB2 are rather small. While the smaller spring size works fine in 2D, in 3D it becomes harder to hit smaller targets, and this holds true for SRB2. If you're less experienced at the game, it might be harder to hit a lone spring lying around on the ground, or you might thread the needle on a row of springs with a small space between them. The third and final issue I'd like to discuss about springs has to do with Ring Slinger. Springs in Ring Slinger are bad. Really, really, really bad. You see, Ring Slinger is a mode where you absolutely need to be moving at all times. And while springs do allow you to do that, most of the time they're placed up against walls where you don't have much freedom in your movement. So most of the time you just end up hitting a spring and one of 2 things ends up happening. Either A, a guy camping behind you or in front of you tosses an explosion ring near you, or B, anyone with half-decent aim snipes you out of the air with a rail ring. The problem here is that springs simply aren't compatible with fast-paced FPS game modes like Match and CTF. Springs are predictable and slow you down a lot if you hit ones facing a wall. And in CTF especially, some maps are designed with flags that Sonic can only access by hitting a row of springs. Twisted Terminal especially suffers from having a base like this, and the update it received in 2.1 replaced a lot of the tight gameplay the map used to have with weeding out campers with explosion rings. Boring. In summary, while springs are a necessary part of classic Sonic gameplay and are recreated somewhat accurately in SRB2, the added third dimension creates some interesting problems with how springs are designed, and the parts about SRB2 springs that do happen to differ from their 2D counterparts have issues as well. Additionally, springs and Ring Slinger do not mix, and result in a lot of cheap hits and base camping. While I don't think any of these issues are urgent and absolutely need to be fixed in the next major update, I would like to suggest the possibility of adding a flag to diagonal springs that disables the player's controls while they're in use. This could be useful for making those diagonal springs in Greenflower Zone less of an obstacle for new players, and would make automated spring chains more effective in general. Well, I guess that'll be all for this video. Sorry if this one is a bit short. I hope I managed to convey some of my problems with springs in SRB2 as reasonably as possible. Granted, this one isn't nearly as big of an issue as some of the issues my previous rants covered, but I'm beginning to really like this format and I want to do more videos like this in the future. Well, that'll be it for this video, I guess. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell icon, and join the Trashbin Central Discord linked in the description down below. I'm off to enjoy the holiday season with my family, and you might not see me for a couple weeks because of it, but have a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year, and yeah, see you later.